Greetings loyal subscribers and honoured guests. Welcome back to another episode of RetroGrade. This week I'm returning to the Williams classics with a look at one of their all-time greats, Joust. In this game you take control of a knight riding on the back of a giant ostrich who wields a lance and does battle against enemy riders who hatch out of eggs. By making contact with their rider at a higher point than they hit you, you can turn them back into eggs and then pick up the egg for bonus points. Enemies can also be dispatched if their eggs fall into the lava or if the fearsome pterodactyl makes contact with them. Eggs that are left lying around for too long will hatch into little men, and then their buzzard steeds will collect them so that they can rejoin the fight. In the early stages, the buzzard riders are normal red coloured ones, but as the game moves on, there will be silver ones who are smarter and faster. If you and your enemy strike each other at exactly the same level, then your lances will collide and you will just bounce off each other. This is one early arcade game where the controls feel really good, and once you've been acclimated to them over the course of a few credits, the birds feel like that they have real weight to them and you can steer them quite precisely through judicious use of the flat button. This is one element that any port should try and get right, another being the sound effects. The sounds in Joust, much like most of Williams' arcade output, are genuinely iconic, so any attempt to replicate them accurately will score extra points in my assessment. While the game does appear a bit antiquated nowadays, one cannot underestimate the popularity of Joust. It was so popular back in its time that there was even a rumour of a Hollywood movie based on the property, which has yet to surface so far. More importantly though, the original arcade version remains immensely playable even today, and remains the benchmark upon all other versions will be judged. I would give it a score of 5 out of 5 eggs without hesitation. Add a second player and the action becomes incredibly enjoyable and frenetic, with you and your friends desperately trying to avoid taking each other out by accident while you try and advance through the stages. Many times I remember playing with someone where we both took it seriously at first, but a game would inevitably fall apart at some stage through either accidental or deliberate slaying of the other player, and then the gloves would be off. Forget trying to kill the enemy riders, the game has now become a duel to the death. What you're seeing here now is the XBLA version of the game, which can be played on the Xbox One via backwards compatibility. I was expecting this version to be pretty much arcade perfect, but Digital Eclipse have actually made some changes to it. There is a background image where the arcade version has none, and the resolution of the sprites has also been increased. This doesn't really bother me, but arcade purists may not be so keen. It would have been nice to have the option to turn off these enhanced graphics, but I wasn't able to find an option to do so. As such, I can't quite give the XBLA version full marks. It's still worth a solid 4.5 eggs out of 5 though. You can currently buy this version for the extremely low price of £1.70 on Xbox Marketplace, but even when it's not discounted, it will hardly break the bank. Let's move on to some of the other versions of the game that were released though. Sadly, I wasn't able to capture the Atari 5200 or Atari ST versions as I couldn't get them to work properly, but I still have quite a few other versions to get through. Next up is the Atari 2600 version. This is actually where I first encountered Joust myself, as a friend of mine had an Atari 2600 and we would get it out and enjoy some of the classics. It wasn't until much later that I would finally play the arcade version. My memory of it is a lot better than the reality, it turns out. Once again, you can't really blame the poor old 2600 as it was extremely underpowered, and the programmers have actually done a decent job of replicating the arcade game. The physics of the flapping doesn't quite feel right, and the eggs don't move the way they should at all. Instead of falling down, they just float around and hatch in mid-air, instantly turning into buzzard riders on the spot. This is certainly not terrible, and there are worse versions to come, but given that there are better options, I doubt anyone would choose to play this one for very long. As a result, I have to give it a score of 2 eggs out of 5. As time moved on and Atari released more powerful hardware, they would return to their classic games, Joust being no exception. We now come to the Atari 7800, and as you can see, this is the best one so far. Visually, it is now very close to the arcade version. It still doesn't sound quite right, but that is due to the limitations of the 7800 hardware. Gameplay feels more or less spot on though, with everything moving around nice and smoothly, and as close to the arcade perfect controls as we have encountered so far. Of all the versions I've checked out running on older hardware, this is definitely the best one, and worthy of 4 out of 5 eggs for sure. Next up is the Atari Lynx version. I never owned one of these myself, as the humble monochrome Game Boy was more than enough for me, and I could also play my friend's Game Gear from time to time. However, I am starting to realise that the Lynx deserves a lot more credit than I have given it over the years. This is an excellent version of Joust. It looks decent, although it definitely runs a fair bit slower than the original, and the sound effects for the most part are identical to the arcades. There are a few sounds missing, which is a shame, but it's not a deal breaker by any means. The gameplay feels good though, with responsive controls and the physics behaving the way you would expect. If I had a handheld version of Joust as good as this one when it came out, I would have been quite chuffed. Most impressive, and definitely worth the score of 3.5 eggs out of 5. The penultimate version of the game I'm going to check out is the NES version, which was programmed by HAL Laboratory. Not sure if Satoru Iwata would have worked on it at all, but I wouldn't really be surprised if he had. Unfortunately though, this version of the game just doesn't feel right to me. It's not horrible by any means, but it feels like HAL have copied the basic concepts of Joust and the level layouts without really trying to maintain the feel or the way the game should look or sound. It's an interpretation rather than a copy. The flapping doesn't feel as good as it should, the graphics really aren't that great, and the sound is pretty terrible in my opinion. If you want a Joust style game for your Nintendo Entertainment System, then you would be much better off with Balloon Fight than this. I'm going to give it a disappointing 2.5 eggs out of 5. Finally, we come to my beloved Commodore 64. What the ever-loving hell happened here? This version of Joust is an absolute travesty. It looks utterly repulsive, runs at a crawl, and your ostrich barely responds to any commands you attempt to give it with the joystick. I am not sure if this is actually officially licensed or a bootleg. Either way, it is an absolute abomination and deserves to die in a fire. It is only worth a score of 1 nasty rotten egg out of 5. So there you have it. If you don't mind the fancy backgrounds and enhanced sprites of the XBLA version, and you own a 360 or an Xbox One, then that is the version I would recommend for you. It would also be worth picking up the Williams Arcade Collection Volume 1 for the PlayStation 2, as the version on there is pretty much arcade perfect, and you get a bunch of other great games as well. That version can be picked up for a few quid easily. If you fancy a slightly more retro version, then the best version after the XBLA release is the 7800 version. That one can be found for £8 loose or about £25 boxed on eBay. You also can't go too far wrong with the Lynx version either, although that is significantly more expensive at £40 boxed. There don't appear to be any loose versions about at the moment. While you probably won't play Joust for hours on end, it's still enjoyable enough to fire it up every so often and play a round or two. Maybe one day we'll still get that movie version we were promised. See you again for another episode of RetroGrade. In the meantime, take care.